Welcome to Shareholders of a Better World, brought to you by TBLI Group. At TBLI Group, we have an established reputation as an organization dedicated to building the ecosystem of global sustainability and impact investing. We're doing this through educating, advising, and facilitating transactions in global sustainability and impact business, as well as capital solutions for private companies, family offices, and fund groups. For nearly 25 years, TBLI Group has created a vertically integrated ecosystem of education to action through TBLI conferences and TBLI consulting. More about our company can be found at tbligroup.com. This webinar is brought to you by TBLI Foundation, which hosts educational learning experiences dedicated to a better planet. Through the foundation, we build sustainable communities by sharing the people and the experiences making a difference to so many of our lives around the world. Our weekly podcasts bring impact thought leaders that are doing and not only chatting. Now let me introduce my guest today. Good afternoon from our studio in Amsterdam. It's absolutely a beautiful autumn day, and I finally got off my ass and went running today, so I'm quite happy. And I'm extremely happy because a very dear old friend has joined us, Mark Campanale. Before I introduce him, for those of you who haven't used the system before, just let me some brief introductions. If you want to clap or find something funny or brilliant, there are 3 emojis that you can use. If you need to make a comment or a question, type it in the lower right-hand corner, and I'll take them after we're finished chatting. And also, if you want to send a private message to anyone in the group, just move your mouse or cursor over the name, and a window will pop up, and you'll be able to send them a private message. So I'm really thrilled because one of the few people who can say, I've been in the sustainable investment space over 3 decades. There aren't many people who can do that. I was looking, when you started with Tessa years ago, you've been doing this a really, really, really long time. Even though you look very young, so you must be doing something right. It must be drugs or something. So I just wanted to let you tell your story for those of you from a strange planet that don't know who Mark Campanale is. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Robert. What a generous introduction. Thank you. And hi to good friends. And I see Seamus on there. Hi, I'm just going to wave to you. So my story, I had a great interest in Southern Hemisphere development-related issues, really from a young age, from about the age of 15. And I worked voluntarily for a local charity that was an aid relief charity. And that got me into some of the details and the depth. Well, anyway, I went on to university to study the politics of rural development and economic history. I did my master's in agricultural and economics, specializing in agricultural production in tropical countries. And then the Band-Aid Live Aid thing happened. Do you remember 1984, Bob Geldof? And so I was crossing the Sahara, as you do, just sort of straight after university. And this is when I first saw the direct evidence of the famine that was happening in East Africa at the time. Got back to London, and a friend had set up a small advisory business, and that was advising Band-Aid on all the different projects to be funded. And he said, come and work with me. We're going to analyze these projects. And he put a huge pile of projects, about 30 or 40 of these projects, Sudan, Chad, Ethiopia, Somalia. He said, let's read through them all, and we're going to write about them, and we're going to make some recommendations. And so Band-Aid, as advisory council, was on the recipient end of that. And I thought, well, maybe my life is going to take me to work in Africa, which I went off to work in East Africa, and encountered my first fair trade projects. I worked with a company that ultimately ended up as Cafe Direct, which is a fairly well-known fair trade brand now. Unfortunately got ill, came back to London, leaving behind all my possessions in Tanzania. And I was doing some work, and I met our dear friend Tessa Tennant, sadly no longer with us. And Tessa said, well, look, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, then it switches very easily to analysing companies. Come and do that with me. And I went to work with Tessa. This was the back end of 1988. So I joined Tesla February 1989 of what was called then the Merlin Ecology Fund. And she said, "Yeah, we're starting investing in these companies. What we're going to do is we're going to find these environmental solutions, recycling and energy conservation and alternative products, natural products, and come in and do that." And we built the first of the real sort of ecological investment funds in the City of London. Listed the first green investment trust. It would have been the beginning of 1991 or something. And then that got me into my first Earth Summit as well, where some of these ideas went over into the Earth Summit. And we founded UCSIF together, the UK Sustainable and Responsible Investment Forum, which we nicked off USIF. So if we're going to have a USIF, we can have an UCSIF. So great fun. So those were my early days. And I never got around to leaving. I think people invited me to leave a couple of times, but I didn't get around to leaving. Here we are, 30 years later, and I'm enjoying it as much as I did February 1989. But sadly, without some people that we both love, like Tessa.
You started probably one of the most important milestones in getting people to take ESG and climate investment more seriously, Carbon Tracker. So what was you've started a lot of things, but I think that really resonated with many people and it woke them up. So give us some color.
All right. So you encounter a few things through life and you stick with them and they just ring through your life as the decades roll by. One of them, I was asked to write for a magazine in 1983 called The Green Insurgent. This was when I was at university. And on it was this thing called climate change. And it said, look, if we keep on burning fossil fuels, we're going to roast the planet. And I was one of the students out in the streets. This was during the Thatcher years and the miners' strike. I was out with the miners collecting money for the strikers and on the street like you do. And I thought, well, I didn't really realize burning coal was going to create problems. But I read this article. I thought, oh, this is strange. And then in around 1991, just through talking and listening to people, I realized it was a forward-looking problem. It's that all the fossil fuels we've burned, but it's all the fossil fuels we're going to burn in the next 2 generations. And with our other good friend, Jeremy Leggett, and this was 96, 97, there was a paper published called The Long-Term Financial Consequences of Climate Change, which got into the financial risks and started to talk about the role of the fossil fuel companies. But it didn't really tell us what the fossil fuel companies were going to do or how much CO2 they owned in their reserves. So I started to think about this more when a company called Xstrata, which is now called Glencore, listed on the London Stock Exchange, and their IPO report, 300 pages, all it is a coal company, had 20 lines on climate change. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound right. And if Glencore or the Xstrata can do this, there's going to be hundreds more. Let's have a look at them. And I started asking amongst my friends at Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and said, how much of this fossil fuels can we burn before we tip through these limits? And no one could answer that question. And what was the role of Shell and Exxon? And no one could answer that question. And so that led to the launch of Carbon Tracker. And all we did is a very simple piece of math. So we took all the world's top 200 coal, oil and gas companies, how much CO2 is in their reserves. If you burn it all, how many degrees of warming do you get to? And that led to us launching a paper called Unburnable Carbon, Are the Financial Markets Carrying a Carbon Bubble, which would have been, this was my good friend Nick Robinson, an analyst who led the research called James Leeton. This was 2011. And we discovered that there were enough fossil fuels owned by Shell and Exxon and the others, the top 200, to take us way beyond 3 degrees. So it wasn't just the government-owned stuff like what the Saudis have and the Qataris have. It's the listed companies. They've got 3 times more fossil fuel reserves just themselves alone to take us to 3 degrees. But that's why we call it a carbon bubble. And we printed 100 copies. I thought, job done. I can go back to my real work. Which was a social stock exchange at the time, as you probably know. And then an American called Bill McKibben got hold of a copy from somebody called Naomi Klein, and Bill wrote about it in Rolling Stone magazines, Global Warming's Terrifying New Math. And he launched the divestment campaign, which came as a bit of a surprise because we didn't talk about divestment at all in the report. We said it's a system risk issue and regulators need to do something about it and pension funds need to do something about it. But he said, no, we're going to divest. And this thing took off. All of a sudden, everyone's ringing us up. Can you give us the numbers? Not just, when I say everyone, I mean the banks, JP Morgan, UBS, everyone wanted to get to the detail. And then I had to start hiring people. And here we are, 10 years on, I'm looking out into the office. Across Carbon Track and Planet Track, I've got 50 colleagues. Where do they all come from? Shockingly, Robert, they all want to be paid. Can you believe it?
What is their problem over here? Why do they want to get paid?
I know. So it's a very happy organization. There's some brilliant people working at Carbon Tracker and Planet Tracker, and they're all getting their heads into the detail about coal, oil and gas, about regulators, accounting, risk disclosure, what do stock exchanges do. I'm now on the advisory board of GFANZ, the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. And we get into the detail. People want to talk about the divestment movement, the engagement movement. So we support Climate Action 100. So we do models on all the world's coal, oil and gas-fired power stations, and we do forward-looking analysis on all the production plans of Exxon and BP and all the other oil and gas majors. And then we share it for free. It's all pro bono, sort of non-profit, and we've got some marvelous foundation partners who allow us to do the research. And last week in New York, with the support of Generation Foundation and the New York Community Trust, we launched the world's first publicly accessible global registry of fossil fuels. So 10 years on, we're still doing this work. People are still using it.
And because you said that if we need to stay at 2 degrees, basically we can't, was 2,200 gigatons that were in the earth that we couldn't access. Does that mean that the oil and gas companies were committing fraud in their reporting? If they can't access that, then it doesn't have the value they're claiming?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, let's say something very clearly. If you multiply the numbers of barrels of oil owned by Shell, that gives you a figure of billions of pounds. The share price or the market capitalization of Shell doesn't reflect the value of its reserves. It's a fraction of its reserves. So it's a carbon bubble as opposed to necessarily a financial bubble. But what we do know is that there is a clear link between the two, because when reserves fall, share prices fall. And if companies don't replace their reserves, people notice. But what we do know is if you take the reserves owned by the world's leading companies, multiply today's price for gas, today's price for coal, and the same for oil, by the barrels of oil, cubic meters of gas, and tons of coal they own, that's $100 trillion of future revenues. So I say that again. It's $100 trillion of future revenues. But that assumes the world is going to 3 or 4 degrees of warming. And that assumes that governments will do nothing and that the world will continue to be on fire or flooded, as we've seen today in Florida or in Pakistan in the last couple of weeks, and that governments are happy for this to carry on, month in, month out, without anyone doing anything about it. In which case, but I think governments are going to do something, and we've got an amazing clean energy revolution. So if you keep 90% of the world's reserves underground, that's an awful lot of revenues which are not going to come to materialize. And there's an awful lot of production that will never happen. So there's 1,000, let's do the maths again quickly. There's the carbon budget to 1.5 degrees is around 300 gigatons. That's how much CO2 we can put in the atmosphere. That's 7 years worth. So we're down to the last 7 years before we go through 1.5. Or we're already going through 1.5, but conditions that confirm 1.5. But another 10 years will go through 2 degrees. So the companies alone own 1,000 gigatons of CO2 in their proven reserves. Exxon, Shell, all the others. That's 3 times the remaining carbon budget. So that means that at least 2/3, probably 3/4 of what Exxon and BP and Chevron and the coal companies own, the ones listed on the stock exchange like Glencore, have to stay in the ground. Now, what should be happening is you should be running a model that says, what do I do if the company I own only gets its revenues halved within a decade? Does that mean it's still a buy or is it a sell? And that number work 10 years on is not yet been done, actually, Robert, if you can understand the point. So if these companies halve in size within a decade, Does the share price go up or does it go down? And what are the models that explain that? Do we get that published from Goldman's and Morgan Stanley and Barclays and the other people that write? No, we don't. So there's a lot of unpublished work that needs to be done on this question.
But you see all of these massive commitments toward net zero and ESG claims 40 to 50 trillion dollars going into it. But if all that money was really going into it, we wouldn't have any problems on climate. So, there is so much nonsense being put out there. You've always maintained quite a high level of civility, which I always admired, that you don't get pissed off.
Blame my parents. and don't go to church on a Sunday morning, Robert, then you can.
So, but how do you maintain it? Because most of the people, a lot of the banks in the U.S., they were funding 40% of the the coal and oil and gas sector. At the same time, they're saying we're very keen on net zero, and now several of the U.S. banks want to pull out of the organization that Mark Carney set up. So how, do you? Yeah,
let's backtrack. Let's backtrack a little bit about what we know we need to do, and what isn't getting done. So we need to halve emissions within a decade. Okay, and we have about $30 trillion of fixed assets of the fossil fuel system. So pipelines, oil rigs, coal-fired power stations, coal mines. We're going to have to lose half, if not most of that, in the next decade or so. What we're doing is we're replacing an old energy system with a new energy system. Now, let's translate that into English speak. Imagine you're ripping out a boiler. What you do is in your house, you sit down, you work out how much does it cost to buy the alternative. Can I afford it? Does the technology work? Who's going to do the work? When do I need to start the work? Now, that's what we're having to do. But imagine doing that on a global stage with global companies. So what you'd expect to see is some costings. The companies would have to say, well, to rip out the old boiler and put in a new one or an alternative, it costs us this much. And it's going to, and this is how much we're going to lose because we can't return profits in the coming year because the size of this is so huge, like ripping out a cement kiln or a steel furnace. Those calculations are what you'd expect to see in the accounts, what you'd expect to see in the company's reports to shareholders or presentations, and that's what's missing. People are talking about net zero, but don't want to tell you how much it's going to cost, and they don't want to tell you what the detail of the plan is, or who's going to do it, or when they're going to do it. And that's why we have a lot of concern about these net zero plans. And you don't need temperature tests for your pension fund. You don't need a carbon footprinting of your portfolio. You just simply need to say, do the companies we own have a transition plan, and can they make it? And if they're in the fossil fuel system, 25% of equity markets are linked to the fossil fuel system: cement, steel, aviation, shipping, car manufacturing. And half of global non-bank corporate bonds are linked to the fossil fuel system. Can the companies survive this transition? If their products are not dependent on the use of fossil fuels or the sale of fossil fuels, they'll make it. If they need to use it, can they afford to replace it with a new system? And who will survive? And then who will win? So who are the Teslas, of tomorrow, of the clean energy system, but in house building and in manufacturing and so on? That's what the market needs to do. And unfortunately, people selling data sets are not very good at explaining systems change or transition in the way that I rather possibly simplistically presented it. But that's the game in hand. And so when I look at a portfolio, I'm looking to see who's resilient to the change in the coming decade and who's got a plan, who will make it. I mean, just to give an example, half of global shipping is moving fossil fuels. So how big is the world's shipping fleet going to be when we stop using fossil fuels? Well, just to speculate, I think it's going to halve. Not all of us are going to be on those great big cruiser liners. The world's shipping isn't going to be cruiser liners, but it's not going to be super tankers either. And we're not going to need LNG, and we're not going to need we're not going to need ships carrying coal. So if I look at a portfolio and people are going to go, well, Mark, we're going to use ammonia in our ships. Well, fantastic, use ammonia in your ships, but you're not going to be using ammonia to ship petrol because we're not going to be using petrol. So we have to look at systems change. If the world's shipping fleet halves, then if you're owning shipping manufacturers in your portfolio, that's not good news for the transition, because you're not going to be needing companies making making tankers. You're not going to be needing shipping building offshore oil rigs. This is post fossil fuel age stuff, So this is what I mean by you're not going to need hugely complicated data sets to tell you what actually is common sense.
But can the industry deliver if they realize, oh shit, I'm going to lose half of my income and my bonuses and all of that? They're going to dig their heels.
Well, they are digging their heels, and and this is why I mentioned the figure 100 trillion. That's $100 trillion worth of reasons not to change anything and keep with what we've got. And that's why the oil and gas industries particularly are spending tens of millions on lobbying in Parliament. And, what is Joe mentioned, the US senator, Democrat senator, is he not a chair of a coal company? Is he not? There he is writing energy policy whilst making a living from it, from selling continuation of business as usual. Well, look, anyway, that's a rather gloomy way of looking at it. The good news is that the new system we're building is going to be bigger, more resilient, more efficient than the old, and it's going to be cheaper. So the cost of gas today in the UK is about £300 a megawatt hour. If you're buying for solar, it's about £45, £48 a megawatt hour. So gas is 6 times more expensive than renewables. And if you think about it for a minute, our energy system, and forgive me for those who've heard this analogy before, but Robert, I know you've got a printer at home. You've got a printer with printing at home, haven't you? A computer with a printer. So what you've actually bought is a printing business. They've got you to get you to buy 6 loads of new printer ink each year. You bought the machine, which was really cheap, but you're fed up having to buy printer ink. The energy system's the same. You've built your power station, but what they're really selling you is your recurring dependency on the stuff going in. You see, that's the real value. And we ship oil and gas from around the world to power stations. And the thing about renewable energy is you don't need to ship anything anywhere. Once you've built your solar system and your wind and your battery storage, or your water system, if you're using hydro, everything else is free. The sun, the wind, the sea, it's all water, it's all free. It comes with it's free. So once you've paid off the cost of your equipment, that's it. Everything else is free. And you're not dependent on another company bringing you the product. So the energy system is going to halve in size, Robert, in the next 20 years, because we're not going to need gas stations and oil refineries, and we're not going to need all the paraphernalia of tankers from one end of the country to the other carrying this stuff, because it's all going to be made at the point we're going to use it. We're going to have solar on the roof. We're going to have air source heat pumps, and they're coming fast, and they're displacing the old system. So it's going to be cheaper, and it's going to be smaller, and it's going to be there in perpetuity. There we are. I'm an optimist.
But I agree with you. I mean, I found the error that was made is calling it renewable energy and not fuel-free energy. So why?
Yeah. Well, there we go. There we are. We arrived at the same place, probably both some time ago.
But also the climate story was about sacrifice and not about resilience. That message was constantly put. You're going to have to sacrifice. You're going to have to give up stuff.
Yeah, and you're hearing that now from the politicians saying the answer to the Ukraine gas crisis is more gas. So in the United Kingdom, we've got people who are saying, let's frack the countryside. It's funny, isn't it? It's amazing how they don't like having wind turbines personally in the countryside, but they're very happy to have countryside ripped up for fracking. It's curious, isn't it? It's almost like an ideological commitment to fossil fuels beyond the point of reason. So the message we've got to get across to everybody is the clean energy revolution is good for working people. It's good for communities. It's good for society. It's cleaner. It's cheaper. It creates jobs. I think the International Energy Agency, you probably saw this, Robert, last week announced there's more people working today now in the clean energy system than there are in the fossil fuel system. Look at all these jobs that have been created from clean energy. So we need to talk about it more. We need to tell people you're saving dollars in the pocket, or euros or pounds or yen, whatever it is. And we need to tell people very clearly what the upside of the switch is and how it's going to make things better for ordinary working people.
But do we have enough runway to get there, to avoid the catastrophic 3 and 4 degrees? No.
No, I'm fooling myself that we do.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm doubtful also. One of the positive things that I've seen, I don't know if you know Professor Ratan Lal. So he's a kind of genius soil scientist. And they've calculated how much carbon could we sequester by restoring the health of the soil through biological treatments, which allow the organism to draw down carbon. And I know companies that have been doing that, experimenting, and they've gotten 3x. He's talking of 330 gigatons of potential drawdown in restoring the health of soil and vegetation. That's a lot. That gives you a lot of runway. I mean, the Earth is
does.
big.
It is, but there's deployment time, and we have to make some calls in life. So there's a whole community around reforestation, around regenerative agriculture. There's all the wonderful work being done around the natural, Paul Hawkins' work and the natural step and Project Drawdown. We support all of those, and I'm a huge fan of it. There's the other side, which is where I'm sat, that says we need to constrain the power and the influence and the financial power of the fossil fuel system and the fossil fuel lobby. And that's why I'm the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels is an attempt to say, look, this is who's doing it. This is where it is. This is how it's affecting communities. That's crucial. But I'm also a fan, and they're meeting today, of something called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, fossilfueltreaty.org, supported by 100 Nobel laureates. The government of Vanuatu came out last week to support it. The government of New Zealand was talking about it publicly. This is where governments who own fossil fuels have to sit together and talk to each other about giving up production rights to keep within the 1.5 degrees budget, what's left of it. And countries will say, well, I want to be the last producer of fossil fuels. I will fight for my rights. And many countries are saying that. That's what you hear from Canada and America and Norway and many others saying, no, we'll be the last to produce. So that's why we need a negotiation. And we need to talk about the reality of keeping most fossil fuels in the ground for many, many reasons. So there's part of us which says, yes, let's restore the planet, let's restore landscapes and reforest. But there's another part that says, no, the urgency is to stop. It's far easier to go to the 100 most powerful politicians and bankers to say, let's do something together, than to persuade 6 billion people to stop fossil fuels overnight. Let's begin that urgent plan of cutting back, investing in new production, which is what Carbon Tracker's work is really focused on. We name the projects that need stopping and where.
But if the oil and gas sector are akin to what I like to call heroin dealers, it's very hard to convince a heroin dealer, maybe it's a good idea that you don't keep selling heroin.
Yeah, I agree with you. So earlier you mentioned GFANZ. Now, I think the bankers know there's a problem. The divestment movements from civil society has been influential. The bankers themselves have woken up and realized, and obviously the stranded assets narrative we developed over the last 10 years has helped frame the debate. The foundations putting their resources into this has been hugely helpful. But GFANZ was all the world's leading banks, most of them, $130 trillion, saying, let's look at this in detail. I'm on the coal retirement working group and the oil and gas working group. And these are very brave, tough discussions and meetings, and they're trying to get to the bottom of it, whether they'll all get there. And then it comes down to the action. What do they propose to do? Obviously, I'm telling them, stop funding fossil fuel expansion. Of course, that's what I'm in the meeting rooms to tell them. But the fact that I'm in the meeting room and they're listening, whether they will act, I think, I've got less hope for some of the American banks than I do for some of the Dutch and French banks. But I think that the world is looking at them. Now, what also happens is that they also know that if the bank's voluntary actions fail, and people like Nigel Topping from Climate Champions, who's very influential in this, have said, look, if you don't act voluntarily, governments will regulate. And by the way, when governments regulate, they often don't do a very good job of it. So do you want that, or do you want to get it sorted? And that is the critical juncture we're at right now, actually, Robert, is if we have another 2 years of failure like we've seen under the COP, well, when I say failure, not talking about fossil fuels, governments will have to step in and do something. Now, it beggars belief, there's been 2,500 coal, oil and gas IPOs and secondary placements since Carbon Tracker was launched 10 years ago. The world's financial markets, I've mentioned 1,000 gigatons of CO2 owned by listed companies. 10 years ago, it was 700. It's gone up by 30, 40%, right? And if I was a funder listening to this conversation, I would say you should fire me because my little campaign, we failed. It's gone up. But we're telling people, and regulators should step in, and we're saying there should be no more IPOs for fossil fuels on the New York Stock Exchange or the London Stock Exchange. And that's the kind of policy intervention I'm talking about, of stop the funding for fossil fuels. Tell the banks you can't make loans to fossil fuel companies planning to expand into the Arctic or planning to expand anywhere, actually. So there are things that could be done. It could be done very quickly.
Are you optimistic that government will? I mean, they can't even put VAT on airline tickets. A bicycle is still 21, 25% VAT, and an airline ticket is no VAT.
So, I know.
Do you really believe that the governments will, get their act together? I mean, there was a hedge fund guy who funded Brexit to make money on the pound dropping. I mean, the forces here are so beyond.
I'm shocked, Robert. Shocked. So look how depressed everyone working within US politics were because of Joe Manchin and the Inflation Reduction Act. And then look how excited everyone was when a deal was cut. And then Joe Manchin just tried to sneak in, loosening the approvals on oil and gas pipelines. And the campaigners yesterday had a victory on that because the Senate would pass through the part of the regulation that would have allowed the loosening of approvals on oil and gas licenses. So look, the euphoria over Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which is a massive boost for renewable energy, massive. Hundreds of billions is going to go into support of wind, solar, the construction of electric vehicle charging points, of supporting electric vehicle adoption. Just today's Financial Times and others are reporting that John Kerry is trying to raise the $100 billion from the private sector or find the capital to invest in climate solutions. So that's all grounds for optimism. But in many ways, of course we've left it too late, like human nature, and we always leave things too late. I mean, I leave things too late. But this one's going to be catastrophic and irreversible. This is the unfortunate problem, is that we'll know within a decade whether we've actually tipped over the edge or the ledge into something completely unknown in human history or for the last few 100,000 years. And I went to a conference in Cambridge of pension fund leaders, and we had one of the leading UK scientists that used to lead the Climate Change Committee come and give the opening speech. And the first thing he said is, I hope you've worked out how much it costs to refreeze the Arctic, because that's what we're going to have to do. You couldn't hear a pin drop because people are not thinking in those terms. And he said it again, we're going to have to work out how to refreeze the Arctic. When you put it in those kind of contexts, people are looking back going, what is he talking about? But then this morning, of course, the reports are 18-foot waves hitting Florida in this Hurricane Ian. Very gentle name for a hurricane, isn't it?
I wanted to take a couple of questions from the
I'll never
audience.
be able to look at someone called Ian ever again without thinking of a typhoon or hurricane storm damage. Yeah.
Stephen Bernickmar had a question. How can we
Oh,
put
yes. Hi,
pressure
Stephen.
on the UK government to stop the fracking nonsense? Mark Carney spoke about the disastrous policies the new government of the UK has announced. What are your any views about this?
Look, the first one is obvious. Well, there's two obvious ones. The price for gas in the UK is not set by what the price of gas produced in the UK. It's a global price. So even if UK fracked gas got to market, it wouldn't cut prices. It'd be the same as the global price because it's a global price. It's obvious. It's always been true. The second is that it will take 5 to 6 years to bring any gas that they think that they found to market. And yet the energy crisis in Ukraine, I'm sorry, it's not in 6 years' time, but God forbid, let's hope it's not. It's an energy crisis today. So even if we did bring fracked gas to market in 5 or 6 years' time, it's going to not help anyone at all. And in 5 or 6 years' time, I'm rather hoping that everyone's ripped out gas boilers from their homes and putting in air source heat pumps, because like they do ordinarily in places like Oslo, which I was hearing about the other day. You know, we don't need gas in domestic boilers. We don't need gas in power stations. So what's going to stop it? I've never been against peaceful civil direct action, Robert. So long as it's civil and peaceful, we protest. And if the moment comes to protest, I'm not very good at lying down in front of lorries, Robert. Young people much younger than me can do that. But I'll be there. I might even put a few quid into a tin.
Well, we also had an activist in the panel, Carolyn, who quit Shell because of their behavior. She's
of course,
she's
absolutely a hero of this year and hopefully for future years. Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of heroes. Unfortunately, believe it or not, I used to work in the oil and gas sector. I worked in the North Sea. I worked in Iran.
My mom was a secretary at Shell 50 years ago. So all of us are linked in some way or another.
I know how they think. And for them, it's, well, if I do this, if I open up the pipeline, I just, make more money. I make my bonuses over here.
Yeah.
And basically, I know this, people hate when I say this. I'm actually happy that energy finally start to get expensive because we were always wasting it.
Yeah,
and the same thing with water. And only when it becomes the price that it should be, whatever, hopefully it'll, it's because of the war, people start to think differently. And I know it's tough for some people who don't have the money, and I wear a sweater and I lowered it to 17 degrees or whatever. So there are some signals that should wake us up. But unfortunately, people think, no, energy should be cheap. And, we just have to keep the fires burning over here. I don't see really a big fundamental mindset shift in people in understanding we need to completely change. We have to make this transition. While that's going on, there has to be a little bit of pain that we can all share.
But listen, I got to say, Robert, this is also a narrative put out by the fossil fuel companies. It's not us, it's you. If only you stop using our products, then we really wouldn't need to be doing the climate change. And it's a very clever thing. Well, of course, we need to conserve energy. And in my house, we have energy insulation, and we wear jumpers in the house, so we use blankets.
Yeah.
And so we should, and that's what my mum did, and I'm sure that's what your mum did, and that's what our kids should do. But at the same time, let's not get away from the power and the influence of the fossil fuel lobby to persuade everyone that the problem is there. I mean, they've known about the climate crisis. There's all the papers coming out from Exxon and the evidence that's been admitted in the US House committee about what Shell said in their private correspondence rather than publicly about their emissions and about their commitment and so on. my audience, and let's go back to this, your audience. Our audience is the financial community, it's the finance sector. And of course, it's important that consumers do something, but it's also important that we influence the influencers within the world of finance. That's what I've tried to do with Carbon Tracker. That's what you've tried to do with what your important work over these many decades we've worked together, Robert, with TBLI. And we need to be even more influential with what we do, with our messaging, and even more professional. So we need to bring sophisticated arguments into Wall Street and into the financial centres of Amsterdam and London and elsewhere, and we need to persuade with well-articulated, well-written arguments. So, if, as I said before, Carbon Tracker's reports all downloadable for free. Our audience are portfolio managers, bond investors. I was in the Netherlands a few weeks ago seeing ING and seeing ABN AMRO and talking to them about their lending practices and trying to understand their approach to managing climate risk. And I still think that the best work that we can do, because the world many of us on the call know, is the financial world. And there's still some serious education. I was looking at some financial advice yesterday by some American consultants to American pension funds, saying there's no energy transition, we'll never get off fossil fuels, there's no point dealing with climate change. And that's exactly what we have to fight. These are the battles we have to be fighting and can continue to fight. And the one that I'm fighting at the moment and shaking my own little can for is the advice of some pension funds have been given, some very big pension funds. There's one called Unisuper in Australia. It's a big $100 billion Australian pension fund. The advice they've got from the consultants is that 4.3 degrees of warming is, quote, an acceptable risk, quote, to the pension fund. Robert, 4.3, Greenland's gone, the Arctic's gone, there's no food production, people are not living where they used to live, they're all going to be living in Greenland or North Canada or New Zealand. There is no commercial activities as we would know. We've not seen that level of warming for hundreds of thousands of years. London, as everyone knows, used to be a steamy swamp. That's why we've got crocodiles skeletons and hyena skeletons underneath London, because it was a tropical environment. This is terrible advice, and it's those sorts of things. The bankers not pricing the risk properly. The pension fund advisors telling pension funds, even if the planet did warm and is uninhabitable, don't worry, your pension fund's not going to be affected. There's still many battles to fight, Robert.
Yeah, I mean, I once had a chat with Goldman Sachs, and I said to the guy from Goldman Sachs, I said, he was head of the Benelux, and I said, I can't prove it, but I have a feeling the investment managers and the advisors are wrong half the time. And he said, no, 3/4. So I was thinking, would I go to a doctor, a dentist, a car mechanic, a painter? If 75% of their decisions are wrong consistently, would I be happy with it? I guess that's okay if you're a professional baseball player. But the advisors were also the ones that were blocking the door on sustainable investment for years until they could start writing hours and making fees on that. So it's unfortunate, and we just have to push back. I want to take a couple of questions from the audience. Leonard wanted to know, I don't see the energy transition happening in time at required scale as long as the ECT-ISDS, which I'm not sure what that is, remains in place. What is your take on this, Mark?
Well, remind us what ECT-ISDS is.
I don't know. Leonard, can you type? Oh, Energy Charter Treaty.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, I mean, we just saw last week, is it Rockhopper, one of the other oil and gas companies, won a case in the Italian courts using the Energy Treaty Charter, which essentially, those who are not familiar with it, means that if you stop a company's oil and gas or coal production under the Energy Treaty Charter Treaty, I get them confused, they can sue. And there are court cases being won. The answer to that is we've got to get rid of the treaty. And there are people looking at that, and there's a campaign that's focused entirely on that.
Okay. Seamus, the Lenny Bruce of the Catholic Church, had a point here. Some say some more about the noise of the U.S. banks on GFANZ or the nexus between food production, consumption industry, and the fossil fuel industry, which, that's a big question.
Okay, so I'm not going to name names, but the two
You can
messages
name
that come.
names. It's okay.
There's two things that have come out that I think I can say that are important. One is we lent on the basis these coal plants would have a 30-year life. Why should we force them to close? Who are we to tell them? So essentially, why should we corrupt our loan book? Now, the work of GFANZ actually is to come up with a financial package to compensate that, but that's a very strong voice. The second, which I think is worse, is, and this comes from the head of a very important department of one of the world's largest asset managers, who is a good friend. He said to me, Mark, the trouble with you is that you think we should act as if the world you want it to be, whereas we have to act as the world as it is, which means climate failure. So how we lend, how we invest, has to be on the basis of climate failure. And who are we to assume that we're going to succeed? Now, I'm no great theologian, but I do think about these issues, and I'm not going to be able to lie on my deathbed thinking that moral position is the right position. I think we have to act and behave and invest for the world we want it to be. And that means stopping the fossil fuel system and replacing it with a clean energy system, and do everything within our powers. Now, this was a fund manager, not an asset owner. And what happens if the asset owners want the world to stop at 1.5? So the investment managers are saying to the asset owners, well, this is what you want, but we're not going to give it to you because we don't think what you're asking for is plausible. And that actually, the idea that we just have to accept the world as it is and trying to change it, you're just an old hippie. Well, maybe I'm an old hippie, but I think we have a moral calling to behave and do as if the world how we want it to be, and we should fight every inch of our days and hour of our life in making sure that we actually do something for the next generation that protects what we have had and ensures what we've got is there for the future, and that's a major motivation for me, and as I'm sure it is for all of us on the call. And I'm not going to tell you the name of the banker, but you'll laugh when I tell you who it is.
No, it's okay. I mean, the ones, so many of the bankers are just so full of shit. They've always been, and the asset managers, whether it's Larry Fink, his story is not about preventing climate. It's how do we make money on climate, and that's a big difference.
Yeah, no, I know. And now their view is the same. And I've heard this back from people that were in meetings with the banks as staff where they challenged the heads of the banks about why are you still funding the fossil fuel system. And one of them, perhaps the world's best known banker, shouted back, so we're not here to save the planet. We're here to make as much money as possible. And that, coming from the leadership of the bank to the staff. Yeah. It reminds me of 07, 08. So long as the music's still playing, we'll carry on dancing. And their view is, as so long as we're still making money from fossil fuels, we'll still keep lending to it. But look, I just want to go back to the good news, which is renewable energy is growing 20% per annum each year. Within 6 or 7 years, we will have built as much renewable energy capacity as we will have built gas and coal-fired capacity over the last 100 years. This is growing at scale very, very quickly. And there's no reason why these growth rates should stall because of solar being cheap and battery storage getting cheaper. So within that mindset, this is why we talk about misallocation of capital, stranded assets, because the bankers think nothing will change in a world which is changing before us. I mean, there's more electric vehicles sold this year than conventional cars in OECD countries. It's absolutely huge, and within a few years, we'll see peak oil, and we'll see decline demand for oil, as we've seen declining demand globally for coal.
No,
And that's unstoppable.
I do see many light points. I mean, four of the best solutions on climate on scalability was what I've seen is geopolymer cement that has no CO2 emissions, but produces cement that uses wastewater, waste material and salt water. Shared X doing regenerative agriculture, sequestering carbon at 300% in less than a year. And then two very cool systems. One produces solar panels from recycled plastic, so it's incredibly light, but 90% reduction in CO2, and it's always recyclable. You can reuse it over and over. There's no glass, there's no aluminum, and made in Europe, believe it or not. And then a Freon-free air conditioning system that produces also cooling and ventilation with 80% reduction in CO2 and no Freon loss. So there are things happening, and I see the demonstrations in Iran, which no one thought anything would happen.
No, I know.
Hundreds of thousands of people fleeing Russia. So things can change quickly.
They can. But just remind us, let's remind you the economics again. If you produce oil at $5 a barrel and you're selling at $100 a barrel, okay, and you're selling a solar panel for $1, but it costs you 95 cents to make, because of the economics of how solar works. It's not a monopoly product like you've got with oil and gas. Oil and gas succeeds because the world is predominantly using oil and gas as a transportation fuel. And that gives you all the reasons why not to change, because people are making so much money. And when I read the papers, a lot of the problem we see with the food crisis and with the energy crisis is with developing countries not being able to afford to pay these very steep prices for food and for oil, because price inflation caused by the fossil fuel system is borne disproportionately by the poorest, as we know. And so the narrative we have to build is of this clean energy system being better for people and cheaper for people. 80% of the world's population live in energy importing countries, but we just want to listen to the energy exporting countries. And when the population of the world gets off fossil fuels, stops importing fossil fuels, and having to find dollars to pay for expensive oil and gas to come into an African country, their currency will hopefully appreciate. They'll get better terms for their tea and their coffee and so on. But the other thing that will happen is the 3-4 societies which have been problematic with fossil fuels, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and dare I say it, and forgive me because I know you're really an American. America, those corrupting politics.
I left in 74.
Those corrupting politics are because of a fossil fuel-based system. And there's the other thing that's going to happen once we come off of this is there's going to be a democratic dividend. Putin will not protect his regime without oil and gas revenues. The same in Saudi Arabia, the same with the system you have in America and Venezuela and even Canada. There'll be a democratic dividend because those corrupting societies will not have the basis of their power and influence from the wealth of the fossil fuel system. That will go. And hopefully we'll have a democratic dividend. Politics hopefully will get back to normal in America. But at least I hope so.
Let's hope so. Final question from Leonard. How do you see resources scarcity play into investor sentiments when these shifts do occur?
Yeah, I mean, people hear the words rare earths when it comes to minerals, metals that go into car manufacture, and literally think these metals are rare. They're not. Studies done by the IEA and Carbon Tracker, we've checked them, that there's plenty availability of these critical minerals that unfortunately not all in the right places, but they're there. Resource scarcity is going to be a challenge, but the difference between, say, fossil fuels, you burn it once, it's gone forever. You put lithium into a battery, once you've finished using the battery, you know what? You take the lithium out and you reuse it again. And the same with all the other metals that go into renewables. You're not destroying the product that you're using like you are with coal and oil and gas. You actually are able to reuse it and replace it. And once your battery in your car isn't able to function, you've got another 10 years of life for it in your basement, which is how people are using the second-hand market. So there will be a point in which, there will be more availability of the metals. Today, because of the race to electrification, there is scarcity. We've seen it in prices: nickel, copper, lithium, manganese. We've seen all these prices go through the roof, but supply will come on stream. And then there will be a massive recycling market for batteries and these other technologies and recyclable wind turbines. I know they're not recyclable now, but they will be. And we'll have a circular economy in the energy system. We do not have a circular economy in the fossil fuel system.
No, that's true. We're coming. I know I'm very cognizant of that you have a hard stop at 4 or 3 o'clock your time.
I do.
What can the audience that's listening to this live and those that will have access to the replay, what can they do to help you?
So in our framing, of course, we have to cut demand for fossil fuels, and of course, we have to conserve energy, but we also have to undermine the power of the fossil fuel system. And so we have to look closely at fossil fuel supply. So if you support campaigning groups, whether it's 350.org or others behind the divestment, or Operation Noah, or people working the divestment campaign, they're doing important work, as I've seen them. I work with some. Support the work of things like Climate Action 100 if you're part of an investment management company or a pension fund. If you like my research work, follow me on Twitter at Campanale Mark or at Carbon Bubble, and you'll hear about our research reports and a little bit about how I see the world. I think we probably all need to pray a little bit more, Robert, and sincerely, because we got a challenging 10 years ahead of us. What else can we do? We can learn to love our families a little bit more, the people that we care about in these dangerous times. I was only joking yesterday with some friends about, has anyone got a good supply of iodine tablets? Here we are just about to sort of Putin wanting to bomb the world with nuclear weapons. Who's got iodine tablets? These are scary times and desperate times. But the last thing, get our newsletter, Carbon Tracker, and second from us, carbontracker.org. Our newsletters just share research, which the audience of is anybody who likes reading, but particularly fund managers and analysts and pension fund trustees. And then, my last one was support and sign up the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, Fossil Fuel Registry, fossilfueltreaty.org. Fossilfueltreaty.org, and that I think is a fabulous campaign led by civil society.
Okay.
Pope Francis came out supporting the idea as well earlier this year. So there's lots of influential people supporting it.
We will send an email with all of these points that how they can help you and support the activities to everyone with the link for the replay, and I'll send that also to you. And if you want a copy of this talk that you can share with your network, I'm happy to send that to you. Let me just take a quick. I'm also very impressed that still very civilized, even though the opposite side is not. Which I have great admiration that you're able to do that. Let's take a quick group selfie. Just wave to the camera, prove that you were actually working today instead of in the bar. So
what do we press? Go. When it says go, we press go selfie when you say.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then it'll take a photo. It'll collate that and add that to all of the other people that joined today. It's not very complex. I want to thank Mark for his brilliance and his commitment and his passion to keep fighting the fight for over 33 years. I want to thank Sam, our producer, crypto genius and ramen critic, Ricky, my absolute better half with no filter, Xi Jinping, our head of transparency and integrity, Vladimir Putin, our senior advisor for military strategy and human relations, Elon Musk, our humility coach, Kwasi Kwarteng, our Mother Teresa spiritual advisor for helping the poor, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the MacArthur Genius Award for Stupidity, Alan Dershowitz, our Senior Vice President for Women's Affairs, for his legal support for Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, and Donald Trump. Thank you all. You've been absolutely spectacular. Thank you, Mark, for doing all of this incredible work, and thank you all for coming. We're going to have a short mixer for those who want to hang around. Mark, thank you so much. And if there's anything we ever can do for you, just let us know.
Thank you, Rob.
You stay well. And we'll go right into the mixer. So if you want, you're more than welcome to join, but I understand you might be quite busy. See you soon.